Good morning again. I will be presenting the first talk of this session this morning related to the early development of taste and flavor preferences and their consequence on eating behavior. So first, this is a summary of my presentation. So I will go through an introduction. Then I will talk about evolution of taste and odor preference at the beginning of life. And then I will evaluate the effect of early taste and flavor preference on food preferences in infants, then looking at the influence of preference on eating behavior in weaning age infants and as well as in toddlers. So to start this presentation, first I want to remind you, because I'm sure you are all aware of that, we're currently talking about metabolic programming during the first 1,000 days of life. That is the period going from conception to the age of 2. So during this short period of life, the quality of the nutritional environment has an impact on the development of later health. And this is known as the DOHAD concept of our developmental origin of health and disease. So we learned a lot about this concept through a lot of epidemiological and experimental studies in animals. And really the question I want to ask today is, what about the programming of eating behavior? So we know about the programming of health status, but what about the programming of eating behavior? So to understand this topic, first we have to consider the evolution of mode of feeding early in life. And we know that it's evolving a lot during this period of the first 1,000 days. First, the infant is fed through the cord during the gestation. And then, as of birth, he will receive oral feeding through the milk, coming either from the mother or from a bottle. Then, around the mid-course of the first year, the complementary feeding will start, and the children will be exposed to a variety of foods with a variety of tastes, flavors, and textures. And then, by the end of the first year, or maybe until the beginning of the second year, the child will receive the food from the family diet. So as you can see, that's a strong evolution in the types of food that are eaten and in the way children will eat. And that's really before the development of what I call food neophobia. That is development of fear of new food that will take place right before, right at the end of the second year. So development of food neophobia. And that's also accompanied by selectivity in eating, also described as picky eating sometimes. So in a relatively short period of time, there are major transitions in the mode of eating of children. And basically what happens during this time frame is that children have to learn how to eat, what to eat, how much to eat, when to eat, and in which context. So all the elements that will ultimately constitute their eating behavior. And this is quite an important aspect to take into account and to understand. And this is why this period is also so important, sensitive, because the children is basically learning what will ultimately constitute his eating habits. In previous research, we have shown tracking in food preference at the end of this period. So we recorded food choices in a group of French children in a nursery setting. So children were served a self-service meal, and we looked at their choices, recording their choices. And we had the opportunity to follow them at a later age, and for some of them up to the age of 22 years. And we showed that the children who chose vegetables most frequently at the age of 2 to 3 years were also the ones who consumed a higher variety of vegetable up to the age of 22 years. So really this idea of tracking, of that the preference or behavior established early is likely to last longer. And so that's really something that drove our attention, and that really took us to really trying to the importance of trying to understand the early determining factors and periods in the development of eating behavior in children, and which I will be showing you today. So talking about eating and eating behavior, I always like to remind the different functions of eating in our very well-established and highly sophisticated society. So eating, the first function of eating is, of course, to cover nutritional needs, and that's really a must, and that's the primary function of eating. But eating is much more than that, and eating also provides pleasure, and eating, and we all acknowledge that in our daily food choices. In general, we try to maximize the pleasure we will get from food, trying to balance also the types of choices we make to make sure that it's nutritionally appropriate, but that's really a driver of choices. Eating also contributes to socialization, and it's hard to imagine any kind of social event where we don't eat together. And it's very important to eat together for socialization. And we had a beautiful example of this during last night dinner, where we had the night dinner together, and that's really something, sharing food together is very important. And it's, of course, very important for the child who is learning how to eat, because he will be learning the social context of eating. And finally, eating is also about identity. So we all have different food cultures, and when we want to take children through the complementary feeding process, we also will want to ultimately bring the child to eat food from our culture. So that's really an important dimension to take into account. So when I present my research, sometimes people ask me, so what is the best solution to feed children? I don't have a best solution. There are many solutions possible across the world, and we have to acknowledge these differences, because food is also identity, and this is something to be taken into account. So pleasure is about a variety of sensory perception, taste, olfaction, and touch, and I will be referring to this in this talk. So our senses are really a gateway to the world, and that's really through our senses that we get input from a variety of stimuli in our environment, and in particular about food, and that's also something we take into account in our daily choices. One important point about taste among the different senses is that it's the only sense, that's specifically devoted to nutrition. So the other senses may cover aspects of nutrition, but taste is really the only one about nutrition. So I will be talking a little bit about taste, and taste, of course, is supported by the different taste receptors we are equipped with, receptors to salty taste, like sodium channels, receptor to bitter taste, sour taste, sweet taste, and also to the fatty taste, which is now recognized as the sixth taste. I will also be talking about olfaction and smell and odors and how they can influence eating behavior. So olfaction has other importance. It's also useful for social communication, so not exclusively for guiding our nutritional choices, but so we will be talking about that. So what about the evolution of taste and odor preference in early life? First question we can ask is, what is innate in terms of food likes and dislikes, and in particular in terms of taste preference or odor preference? Well, in fact, not much. So we know from a variety of studies, and some are quite old, that there's a drive for sweet taste and the rejection of bitter taste at the beginning of life, and that's a very highly conserved observation. So it's true in human infants, but also in primates and in some rodents. And the rejection of the bitter taste is also very well maintained across species, with the rejection of bitter substances can be seen in human infants, primates, and rodents. So really, that's probably very important for the evolution, because many bitter substances are potentially toxic, or there are pharmacological effects. So we want to make sure that we don't ingest those substances. And the sweet taste signals the presence of calories or maturity in fruits, for instance. So it's also very important to be able to recognize this to get appropriate calories. In terms of odor preference, we know from the work by my colleague Benoit Charles that there's an avoidance of unpleasant food odors such as butyric acid, the smell of cheese, but that's really what we know about preferences that are shown at birth. There are not many other preferences at birth. And so all the rest is learned through experience. Now, if we want to detail a little bit more the taste preference at birth, as shown here, so for the major taste qualities I talked about previously. So again, as I mentioned previously, sweet taste is light. So this is not a newborn, it's a 2-month-old baby that participated in one study in our lab. So when we present a sweet solution to children, they will express expressions of pleasure. And in general, the sweeter the solution, the more they consume. So that's really something that is light. Sweet taste is light. When it comes to bitter solutions, it triggers expressions of disgust in babies, and it's generally not consumed or less consumed than other solution or than water. Talking about salty taste, it also triggers expression of aversion or indifference. In this case, you can see marks of aversions with really a very typical expression of disgust in the child, and it's little consumed. So it's not liked at birth, the salty taste. Umami taste, or the taste of sodium glutamate, is quite light, in fact, in children, and it triggers expression of pleasure and can be consumed or more consumed than water, especially when umami taste is present in a light soup. Sour taste triggers expression of disgust, and that's very prototypical of the type of reaction you can expect with sour solution, and it's little consumed by infant. And as far as fat is concerned, there are very few observations regarding fat preference at the beginning of life. So to expand a little bit this knowledge about fat preference in taste preference in infants, we developed a study, so the Opaline study, the Observatory of Food Preference in Infants of Children. That was a birth cohort that we set up in Dijon, in France, where my lab is, with over 300 children at inclusion. So we performed the longitudinal evaluation of taste preference at different stages through the first 2 years of life. At 3 months, that is before the introduction of complementary feeding. At 6 months, that is around the time of complementary feeding, 12 months and 20 months, right before the appearance of food neophobia. So we evaluated preference for all basic tastes and also to fat taste for some infants. So we used the following compounds to evaluate preference: sodium chloride for salty taste, urea for bitter taste, citric acid for sour taste, sodium glutamate for umami taste, and a mixture of sunflower and rapeseed oil for fat taste. To evaluate the preference for each taste, we used a procedure where first we presented a bottle of water for 45 seconds, then a bottle, for instance, of salty solution, again for 45 seconds, and we repeated this. So altogether, for each taste, children could experience 4 bottles, and so we recorded the infant's reactions, and that was recorded by the experimenter. So the situation looked like that. The baby was seated in a chair, and the experimenter was feeding the baby, and the mother was also looking at the situation. We measured the volume that was consumed of from each bottle, and using this volume, we define an ingestion criteria that is really the proportion of each solution that is, of the salty solution, for instance, salty solution that is consumed over the 4 bottles. And we did the same for the liking ratio using the liking data provided by the experimenter. And this is what is represented here. So that's really a plot of the evolution in taste preference at the ages where we measured it for all the basic tastes. So the higher you go on the top, the more the taste is liked, and the more you go on the bottom, and the less the taste is liked. So what did we observe? First, we observed that at 3 months, sweetness is preferred over water. At 6 months, sweetness, saltiness, and umami taste are preferred over water, so there's a developmental component in the liking for taste preference at this age. At 12 months, saltiness and sweetness were preferred over water, and the fat emulsion was rejected over water. And at 20 months, all tastes except the sweet taste were rejected by the infant, really showing a development in acceptance of these taste solutions. What happens in between? Well, children learn about food, and they expect to find this taste not in water, but in solid food, and that may explain this rejection. When we look at developmental trajectories in taste acceptance, the orange line here is for saltiness, and you can see that acceptance evolves sharply during this period, and that's really the taste for which acceptance has the strongest developmental evolution, with a very strong increase in acceptance of the salty taste between 3 and 6 months. For sweet taste, sour taste, and umami taste, the acceptance were parallel. The acceptance of bitter taste was relatively stable over time, and during the first 2 years, the fat emulsion triggered indifference, and then it was rejected after 12 months. So no preference for the fatty taste at birth. So. Okay, when we looked at liking ratio, as reported by the experimenter, just looking at the child when he drinks water from the bottle, we can see that the situation or the trajectories are pretty much the same, except that all evaluations are much lower. So we see same patterns of acceptance trajectories, more rejections, and we show that, in fact, ingestion data better discriminate trajectories across primary tastes than the liking ratio. So the rest of my talk, I will focus more on the ingestion data that we got. So why is it so? Why we see more rejection when we ask the experimenter to report on children's liking of the basic tastes? Well, to understand this, we analyze the facial expressions of the children when they are presented with the bottles. So using a technique adapted from Paul Ekman, it's named the Facial Action Coding System, or FACS. So basically, it records or asks a trained experimenter to record action units that are movements of the muscle of the face, and that are supposed to really translate emotions about food that are tasted. So we looked at this facial expression at the age of 6 months, and we grouped this expression into either negative or positive expressions. And what we observed, so it's always compared to water here, that is in gray. So for instance, the sour taste, with sour taste, we see more negative expressions and less positive expression than for water. So really a pattern of expression revealing faces in the children. For the bitter taste, we see also more negative expressions, but not less positive expression. And for the sweet taste, that is very interesting, I think, we see less negative expression than with water, but not more positive expression. So sweet taste is very much liked by children, but it doesn't really make them smile. So it's really something that has to be kept in mind. It's much easier to see negative reactions on the face of children than positive expressions. And this has to be kept in mind because this is also what parents read when they feed their children. They read those expressions, and they are much more likely to note the negative ones than the positive ones. So coming back to our ingestion ratio, we wondered about individual variations in taste preference, looking at the effect of individual characteristics. So we found that the acceptance of the salty and umami taste were lower in girls than in boys at the age of 20 months, and that acceptance of fat was higher in infants born heavier or taller. So as if the early stage or early growth curves were predicting higher fat acceptance. So is it related to higher need for energy? Really, we cannot say from our data, but that's something that could be explored with more detail. So pretty much in the same way as we measured taste preference, we measured odor preference in infants for odors of food at different ages. So we did that at 8, 13, and 22 months. And to do so, we used several odorants. So we used the non-odorant control, and we used pleasant odors and unpleasant odors. So pleasant odors were, for instance, odors of apple, strawberry, peach, and vanilla, and unpleasant odors were like bell pepper odor, cheese odor, fish, and garlic odor. That was rated by an adult panel as being unpleasant. So, to measure odor, so we organized this session where we gave the child a bottle, and the bottle contained odorized cotton pad at the bottom, and we measured behavior, really with the assumption that a child who would play with the food like that and really mouse on the bottle would like the odor, because you can see that the nose is very close to the top of the bottle that was open. But we also looked at rejection behavior, where the child would really put the bottle away, not to play with, and probably reflecting rejection of the odor. So that's how we coded those data. So all the sessions were videotaped, further analyzed. So as I said, we measured mousing duration and no handling. So mousing being like this, or no handling with just the bottle here, or even rejection when the bottle was rejected on the side. So for odorized and control objects, and that's what we look at. We look at contrasted taste preference. Oh, it's interesting. Sorry, so this slide doesn't show very well. I will go to the conclusion, sorry. What we found with the odor preference, we found avoidance behavior. So that's basically what is represented here, the mousing behavior according to the different odors. It's not showing well. So at 8 months, there is no preference for any odor, no rejection. At 12 months, we can see rejection, significant rejection for the odor of trimethylamine, that is the odor of fish, and for the odor of garlic. So in conclusion, we can say that with this evaluation of odor preference, we found avoidance behavior, but no attraction behavior, and which was in line with the previous results by Soussignan and collaborators. And then we can interpret this by the fact that olfactofacial system integrates on negative versus positive pole of the hedonic space. So really, there's a hedonic differentiation in odors. And we also noted an avoidance of vanilla odor at the age of 20 months, which was not expected, because we expected positive reaction to vanilla odor. Okay, so now we looked at the early preferences for taste and odor, but now the question I want to ask is, are these preferences influenced by early experience to a variety of sensory stimulation at the beginning of life? And that's what we looked for. So I will drive you through some background. So it was shown that the flavor of the food consumed by the mother are transmitted into the amniotic fluid and the maternal milk. And so in particular by work by Julie Menella and Benoît Schall and also Hélène Hausner in Denmark, so in different parts of the world, US, France and Denmark. So this is not a uniform phenomenon, mechanism. We know that some flavors from food are more likely to be transmitted into amniotic fluid or into milk. And it depends on the chemical structure of the compound, and it may depend also on the biology of the mother. So we know that this phenomenon is possible, but it's not necessarily uniform or true in all mothers. But what was found was that, what was shown was that exposure to specific flavors in utero during this period, it's associated to a higher attraction for the specific odor that was exposed to in utero at birth. And that's work by my colleague Benoît Schall, and that was shown with odor of fennel. And it was shown also that the exposure of specific flavors in utero is associated to higher acceptance of the specific food with this specific taste at the beginning of complementary feeding. So that's a work by Julie Menella. She asked a pregnant mother or breastfeeding mother to drink carrot juice, and she realized that children at the beginning of complementary feeding would be more willing to accept food flavors with carrot juice than plain food. So really like an imprinting effect of this consumption in utero or in lacto. And the work by Epper also showed that ingestion of garlic during was associated with higher acceptance of similarly flavored food like potato gratin flavor with garlic later in childhood. So really also an imprinting effect with the garlic flavor there. Regarding exposure to variety of flavors, so we know that, in utero, so there's this specific phenomenon of exposure to specific flavors, and we know that it can work in lacto also. And it was shown by Julie Menella that exposure to specific flavors in lacto is associated also to a higher acceptance of the specific food at complementary feeding. And it's, in fact, this effect was shown by Hélène Hausner also just after breastfeeding without exposure to the specific flavor, probably because breast milk carries a variety of flavors from the mother's breast, and that's imprinting or favoring the acceptance of new food at the beginning of complementary feeding. So it's really like a general phenomenon, not specific phenomenon. So we suppose that variety of flavor exposure in breast milk may be key and not only specific exposure to a given flavor. Concerning exposure to taste in the milk feeding context, in our opaline cohort, we found that we looked at the impact of exposure to breast milk. We know that breast milk contains more glutamate than formula milk. In fact, it's 14-fold higher concentration in glutamate. We also know that breast milk is sweet, but glutamate may impart a slightly umami taste in the milk. And we found that a longer breastfeeding duration was associated to a higher preference at the age of 6 months for the umami taste measured, as I explained previously. So this positive association, we interpret it in relation to the longer exposure to glutamate-containing food, milk, and that's triggering a higher acceptance for the umami flavor. So in order to complement a bit this vision, we, using still our data from the Opaline database, we really try to describe all the taste exposure of this group of French infants by profiling the taste of the food they were exposed to and calculating an exposure score to the taste in food. And that's what's represented here. So we plotted this for the first year. we looked at exposure to a variety of taste. And as we can see, the first taste that children are exposed to is a sweet taste. So it's the taste of the milk here, and that's why it's the only domining taste at first, because the milk is sweet. You can see a reduction in exposure here, just because we calculate this score, taking into account the frequency of consumption, and during this period, the number of milk feeds per day is slightly decreasing, explaining this decrease in exposure. And after complementary feeding onset, which starts about right after 5 months, we see again an increase in sweet taste exposure, really revealing that these children are quite exposed to sweet food, and which can be from a variety of sources like sweetened dairy products or other kind of food like biscuits and desserts and so on. Then the second taste that was most exposed in this cohort is the sour taste. And it came a bit as a surprise because we didn't expect this to be the most exposed taste. This is in relation to consumption of fruits and also to consumption of dairy products, fermented dairy products like yogurt, which are also slightly sour. And then salty taste was very little exposed, of course, because we have the recommendation of not adding salt in the food in complementary foods. So, which explain this low exposure. And then umami and bitter taste. So umami is not very present in the French, in the diet of French children, and bitter neither. Oops. And we went a bit further. So we try to explore the association between exposure to each of these tastes of the first 6 months and taste preference using the ingestion ratio that I showed you previously, but we found no association. So in fact, we consider that the exposure were rather homogeneous in children, and maybe could not explain strong variations in, or the variations we observed in taste preferences. Oops. We also looked at determinants of exposure to tastes. So on this graph, I plotted the exposure to fatty taste and sweet taste at 3 to 6 months, 7 to 9, and 10 to 12. Sorry, so this is not again not working very well. We found a higher exposure to sweet and fatty taste in boys than in girls at 10 to 12 months. So again, this came a bit as a surprise because we didn't really expect this difference, but it probably means that boys and girls are not fed in the same way, or they are not fed the same food as of this early stage of life. We found that exposure to sweetness was higher when complementary feeding introduction started before 6 months, revealing that the mother who started complementary feeding early, probably too early, also introduced a variety of sweet food to the children. And also we found that sweetness exposure was higher when infants were fed a lot of adult food compared to baby food and compared to homemade foods. Regarding fattiness, we found again almost similar effect, but we found that children were more exposed to fattiness if they were fed adult food rather than homemade food and baby food. So really difference according to the types of food they are fed. So now that's an overall summary of other findings regarding the importance of early taste experience on the development of taste preference from a variety of studies, in particular from the model group in the US. So infants exposed to sugar water in the first 6 months of life are more likely to prefer sweetness at the age of 2 years. So really exposure to sweet taste through bottles of sweetened water is associated to higher sweetness preference. Infants exposed to a milk with lower sodium chloride content tend to prefer salt when they are a teenager. And in this case, it's not an exposure effect, but probably they lack chloride at some point, and then they want to compensate. Interestingly, infants exposed to hydrolyzed cow milk protein formula, so a formula that are used for allergic infants, or infants who are allergic to cow milk protein. They like more bitter, umami, and sour taste at the beginning of complementary feeding, and they also like more sour-flavored apple juice when they are 4 or 5 year old. So again, an imprinting effect of the exposure to this very specific type of formula, which has a very specific taste. And finally, sodium exposure during the first year is associated to a higher salt preference at the age of 6, and to more salt licks demonstrated by the children around the age of 4 years. So again, effects of imprinting on preference. Now let's have a look at how individual taste and odor preference can influence eating behavior in infant, and that will be the last part of my presentation. So again, back to our Opaline data. So we looked very closely at the acceptance of food according to their taste. So we asked parents to very finely describe the quality of the food they introduced at the beginning of complementary feeding, providing us with a lot of information about addition of salt or sugar, or the way they cooked the food, so we could predict the taste the food would have. So first, at the start of complementary feeding, what we found was that infants easily accept most of the food they are fed. And we observed here, you can see that's 88% of positive reactions to new food. So when we talk about food neophobia, that's not at the early stage of weaning, that's probably later on. And then when we break it down, according to the taste of the food that are offered, we found that salty vegetables, that are a vegetable that either contain salt or salty ingredients, were more accepted than bitter vegetables or sweet and bitter vegetables. So children were sensitive enough to differentiate the taste of those food, and they exhibited different reactions, leading to a bit lower positive reaction in this case. But still, it was still quite positive, so we cannot say that these foods were rejected. They were just a bit less liked. When we came back to our data, we looked at whether preference could predict acceptance of food, and we saw that individual variations in acceptance of the sweet taste at 6 months predicts the acceptance of some sweet food. So the children who like the sweet taste the most will like sweet taste the most. And we found the same regarding umami food and sour food. So really, these preference will reflect also preference for food with a variety of tastes. We did the same for looking at the role of odor preference on acceptance, and what we found was that at the age of 12 months, individual reaction to some food odors modulate the acceptance of the corresponding foods, in particular for unpleasant odors. And for instance, we found that children who liked more the odor of 3-methylamine accepted more fish, which has a typical 3-methylamine flavor. And the same, the children who liked more the odor of dimethyl disulfide would accept more sulfurous cheeses. That's what's summarized here. To go a bit further, we were wondering about the effect of the sensitivity to taste and odors on the food neophobia in children, really characterized as a rejection of a variety of foods. And we wondered whether reaction to taste or reaction to odors would predict manifestations of food neophobia in children at 2. And so we looked at our data, still in our Opaline cohort, and in fact we found that, that's a reaction to odors that was significantly associated to food neophobia, but not reactions to taste. So, and that's interesting because You can see odor perception as a distant signal to foods, and so children who are more reactive to the smell and the odor of food may be more neophobic because it signals maybe food that they don't know or they don't want to be tasting. But the taste in itself or the individual reactions to the taste are not related to neophobia, and maybe because when it comes to taste, children has already to have accepted to put the food in the mouth to feel the taste, and so it has overcome the neophobic reaction of putting the food in the mouth. More globally, we try to integrate all this data and trying to predict food likes at the age of 2 years that were collected again in the frame of our cohort, looking at how children would accept food at the beginning of complementary feeding, looking at flavor exposure in utero or in lacto, so asking the mother to fill out diaries to report food that she had been eaten during these periods. We looked at exposure frequency after the start of complementary feeding and how that, we wonder how that would predict food acceptance or food likes. We looked at the variety of food consumed at around the start of complementary feeding, and also at the effect of reactions to stimuli, odor or taste stimuli, and how that would predict these food likes and dislikes. So we evaluated this model, for instance, for vegetable, and this is what I will show you. And oh, sorry, yeah, I forgot to mention. We also looked at parental feeding style. You will learn more about feeding styles later in the talk by Kim Malan, but we hypothesized that that would also interact with the development of food preference. And in fact, the results showed indeed that there was a stronger prediction of food acceptance at the beginning of complementary feeding in relation to taste, reaction to tastes and odors. We found that exposure frequencies influence liking for vegetables, that variety at the onset of complementary feeding influenced acceptance at complementary feeding, which tracked later on. And we found that permissive style was negatively associated with liking for vegetable at this age. So altogether, all these factors work together. The only thing that we could not find was the impact of flavor exposure related to maternal consumption of vegetable during gestation or lactation on food acceptance at complementary feeding. So just to show that how the different determinants of eating behavior can interact together and establish early preference. So in conclusion, we can say that children are born with the ability to taste, smell, and discriminate foods, including milks. So sometimes we can see that, we can think that they don't perceive much, but yes, they do, and they have very finely tuned sensory abilities. And they are also born with the ability to learn to like a new food and its sensory properties. But there are marked reactions to olfactory and taste inputs that may hinder the learning process, and in particular if the parents notice negative reaction and react on that. So through the effect of eating experience, taste and olfactory cue acquire a biological significance in relation with the nutritional impact of the food they are associated with. And so that's really like the engine for learning about food. And learning abilities are quite high between the onset of complementary feeding and the age of 2 years. So that's really a window of opportunity to introduce food from the family diet, for instance, vegetables. And also parental feeding style and practices, like repeating exposure to food, may modulate this learning process, and you will learn more about that in the following talks. Practical implications, things you can take home message maybe. Breastfeeding until the start of complementary feeding may enhance the acceptance of new foods. When tasting and smelling new foods, children are more likely to display negative facial expression than positive ones, but they might also continue eating. So parents have to be explained that it's not because children make a face that they will never learn to like the food. It's a learning process that they can overcome these initial reactions. So they should continue offering new foods for learning to take place. That's very important. And for some children who are very sensitive to taste and odors, parents should be ready to persist in their willingness to offer new food without forcing. So I will end just acknowledging my colleague and my beautiful team in Dijon, in particular Camille Schwartz, Sylvie Sanchou, Sandrine Monnery-Patrice, and also Sandra Wagner, who are highly involved in the results that I presented today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sophie, for that very comprehensive and very informative lecture. Now, indeed, the metabolic programming for the first 1,000 days starts with actually programming for eating behavior, as she has said. So she lectured on the different tastes and flavor preferences. So are there any questions now from the floor?